There's a moment in Outlast's Whistleblower DLC where you're crouched in a locker, trying to keep your breathing quiet, and you hear him singing. The melody drifts through the vocational block like something from another era, sweet and nostalgic, a song about wanting a girl just like the girl that married dear old dad. Eddie Gluskin's voice is smooth, almost charming, and if you didn't know better, if you couldn't see the bodies hanging from the gymnasium ceiling or smell the blood on his makeshift operating tables, you might think he was just a man in love. But Eddie Gluskin isn't a man in love. He's a broken thing wearing the costume of romance, a monster who believes himself a gentleman, and understanding how he became this requires walking through layers of trauma, institutional cruelty, and psychological devastation so profound that by the end, you'll understand why some people can never be saved. Tonight we're doing a complete psychological analysis of Eddie Gluskin, known throughout Mount Massive Asylum as the Groom. We're not just cataloging his crimes or listing his symptoms. We're going deep into the architecture of his damaged psyche, examining how childhood sexual abuse rewires the developing brain, how trauma creates the conditions for violence, how institutional torture masquerading as treatment can amplify pathology until the person you're looking at barely qualifies as human anymore. This is going to be thorough and unflinching because Eddie deserves more than dismissal as just another horror game villain. His story is a case study in how abuse creates abusers, how systems meant to heal can destroy, and how the human mind fractures when subjected to forces it was never designed to withstand. Settle in, get comfortable. We're going to take our time with this because understanding Eddie Gluskin means understanding something dark and fundamental about trauma, about violence, and about the terrible things that happen when damaged people fall into the hands of those who see them as experimental subjects rather than human beings. Let's begin where all tragic stories begin, in a childhood that should have been safe but became something else entirely. Eddie Gluskin was sexually abused by his father and uncle. The game tells us this directly through patient files that Wayland Park discovers while fleeing through Mount Massive, clinical documents that use sterile psychiatric language to describe something utterly devastating. The abuse was repeated, systematic, and photographed. Those three words carry weight that's easy to gloss over, so let's sit with them for a moment. Repeated means this wasn't a single incident but an ongoing pattern. Abuse that happened again and again while Eddie was still a child, still developing, still forming his understanding of what the world was and how people treated each other. Systematic means it was organized, that his abusers planned these assaults, that there was forethought and intention behind the violation. And photographed means they documented it, creating visual evidence of their crimes that served both as blackmail to ensure Eddie's silence and as material for whatever sick purposes they had in mind. This is the foundation everything else builds on. To understand what this does to a child, we need to understand how the developing brain processes inescapable trauma. When a child is hurt by strangers or by people outside the family, the damage is terrible, but there's at least a framework for understanding it. Bad people exist in the world, and sometimes bad things happen. But when the people hurting you are the ones meant to protect you, when your father and uncle transform from caregivers into predators, the child's entire understanding of reality collapses. There's nowhere safe. There's no one to turn to. The people who should defend you are the ones you need defending from, and that contradiction creates what psychologists call a double bind, an impossible situation where every option leads to harm. The child's brain, confronted with this impossible situation, begins adapting in ways that will mark them for life. The stress response system, that ancient neurological network, designed to help us survive immediate threats, gets locked into permanent activation. Normally, the system works like an alarm. Danger appears, adrenaline floods your body, you fight or flee, the threat passes, and everything returns to baseline. But when you're a child being repeatedly abused by family members, there is no return to baseline. The threat never really passes because the threat lives in your house, eats dinner with you, tucks you into bed at night, so the alarm stays on. Cortisol and other stress hormones bathing a developing brain in chemicals meant for short-term emergency use. And over months and years, this causes physical changes to brain structure. The hippocampus, which processes and stores memories, often shows reduced volume in adults who survived childhood sexual abuse. The amygdala, which detects threat and processes fear, becomes hyperactive, seeing danger everywhere because danger has been everywhere. And the prefrontal cortex, that crucial region responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, and rational decision making, develops abnormally when it's marinated in stress hormones during critical growth periods. These aren't metaphors or abstract concepts. These are measurable, physical alterations to the organ that generates consciousness, personality, and behavior. Eddie Gluskin's brain was shaped by trauma before he had any choice in the matter, wired for a world where trust is impossible and violence is ordinary. Beyond the neurobiology, there's the psychological damage, and this is where things get even darker. Children who experience sexual abuse often develop what clinicians call traumatic sexualization, a complete distortion of their understanding of sexuality and relationships. For most people, sexuality develops gradually through adolescence and early adulthood, associated with pleasure, intimacy, connection, and eventually consensual adult relationships. For Eddie, sexuality was introduced through violation. His earliest sexual experiences weren't about connection, but about power, about adults using their complete authority over him to do things to his body that he couldn't prevent or understand. Sex got wired in his developing brain not as intimacy but as violence, not as mutual pleasure but as domination, not as something that happens between equals but as something the powerful do to the powerless. This warping of sexual development has consequences that ripple through every future relationship. When Eddie eventually developed his own sexual feelings as he grew older, those feelings would have been channeled through this distorted framework. He wouldn't have learned to seek equal partnerships because his template for sexuality had nothing to do with equality. He wouldn't have understood consent because consent had never been part of his own experience. Instead, sex and power would have been fused together in his mind, inseparable, and that fusion is visible in everything he eventually became. The photographs his abusers took add another dimension of horror. This wasn't impulsive abuse, some terrible mistake made in a moment of weakness. It was premeditated and organized, carefully documented for reasons that suggest both control and ongoing exploitation. For Eddie, knowing he was being photographed during the abuse would have intensified the shame and powerlessness exponentially. The violation wasn't just happening in the moment, it was being recorded, made permanent, potentially shown to others or kept as trophies. That kind of exposure creates a particular flavor of trauma, where the abuse extends beyond the physical acts into a psychological realm where privacy, dignity, and bodily autonomy are completely annihilated. Many children in these situations develop extreme dissociative responses as a survival mechanism. When you can't physically escape, your mind escapes instead. Dissociation is the brain's emergency off switch, the ability to separate your conscious awareness from what's happening to your body. During the abuse, the child learns to go away, to not be present, to float somewhere above or beside the terrible things being done to them. In the moment, this is protective. It allows the child to survive experiences that would otherwise shatter them completely. But dissociation, like most survival mechanisms, comes with a cost. It becomes a habitual response to any stress, not just extreme trauma. The child who dissociates to survive abuse often becomes an adult who dissociates during conflict, during intimacy, during any situation that triggers echoes of that original helplessness. Personality fragments splits into parts that don't always communicate with each other, and the person develops a relationship with reality that's fluid and unreliable. Eddie's patient files don't explicitly state that he exhibited dissociative symptoms, but given the severity and duration of his abuse, it would be nearly impossible for him not to have developed these mechanisms. The question isn't whether he dissociated, but how severe that dissociation became and how it manifested in his later pathology. We'll see echoes of it in the vocational block, in the way he seems to exist simultaneously in a romantic fantasy and a charnel house, how he can speak tenderly about love and marriage while standing in a room full of mutilated corpses, how his internal reality and external reality seem to have completely diverged. The abuse also destroyed any possibility of Eddie forming healthy attachments. Attachment theory, the framework developed by John Bowlby and refined by decades of subsequent research, explains how our earliest relationships with caregivers create templates for all future relationships. When caregivers are consistently responsive, warm, and safe, children develop secure attachment. They learn that the world is trustworthy, that their needs matter, that relationships are sources of comfort rather than threat. They grow into adults who can form intimate partnerships, maintain friendships, and regulate their emotions through connection with others. Eddie didn't get that developmental foundation. His primary male caregivers, the father and uncle who should have protected him, were predators who used their power to violate him repeatedly. Any attachment Eddie formed to them would have been what researchers call disorganized attachment, a pattern seen almost exclusively in children who are abused by their caregivers. Disorganized attachment is characterized by profound confusion about relationships. The child simultaneously seeks closeness with the caregiver because they need care and protection, and fears that closeness because the caregiver is also the source of harm. They want connection but can't trust it. They crave safety but have learned that safety is an illusion that can transform into violence without warning. Adults with disorganized attachment histories display chaotic relationship patterns that make stable intimacy nearly impossible. They idealize potential partners, projecting fantasies of perfect love onto people they barely know, and then rage when those people inevitably fail to meet impossible expectations. They struggle with boundaries, unable to understand where they end and others begin, often swinging between complete enmeshment and total withdrawal. They seek to control their partners absolutely because surrendering even a small amount of autonomy triggers terror of abandonment or betrayal. And tragically, they often reenact their early trauma in adult relationships, either by unconsciously seeking out partners who will hurt them, or, in the darkest cases, by becoming perpetrators themselves, inflicting on others what was inflicted on them. This is the foundation Eddie Gluskin was built on, and it's crucial to understand this before we move forward because it explains so much of what came later. Before Mount Massive Asylum, before the morphogenic engine experiments, before the vocational block became his hunting ground, there was a child who was systematically violated by the people meant to protect him. That violation restructured his brain during critical developmental windows. It destroyed his capacity for healthy attachment. It warped his understanding of sexuality, power, and relationships into something unrecognizable. It created psychological wounds that would never heal, not because healing is impossible for abuse survivors, but because Eddie never received the kind of intensive, trauma-informed care that might have given him even a small chance at recovery. The vast majority of people who survive childhood sexual abuse do not become violent offenders. This is important to state clearly. Most survivors struggle with depression, anxiety, relationship difficulties, and complex trauma responses. But they do not become killers. They do not mutilate and murder. So the question we need to ask isn't whether childhood sexual abuse explains Eddie's later violence, because it doesn't, not by itself. The question is what other factors converge with that foundational trauma to create a person capable of the horrors we see in the vocational block. Somewhere between the abused child and the man who would eventually be committed to massive asylum, Eddie Gluskin crossed a line that most trauma survivors never approach. He became a perpetrator. The game is sparse on specific details, but the documents make it clear that before his admission to the asylum, Eddie was a serial killer. His victims were women. He mutilated them. The exact body count, the methods he used, the way he selected his victims. All of this remains implied rather than explicit, but we can extrapolate from what we see in the vocational block, from the bodies hanging in the gymnasium, from the crude surgical equipment, from the evidence of forced gender reassignment surgeries performed on male inmates to create his brides. This transformation from victim to perpetrator is uncommon, but not unprecedented, and understanding it requires looking at multiple factors that converge in specific, tragic ways. The first factor is the nature of the original trauma. Sexual abuse, particularly when it's severe, chronic, and perpetrated by caregivers, creates higher risk for later perpetration than other forms of childhood adversity. This isn't because abuse teaches people to abuse in some simple cause and effect way. Human beings aren't learning machines that automatically repeat what was done to them. Rather, severe childhood sexual abuse can damage the specific psychological structures needed for empathy, impulse control, and appropriate sexual development. Empathy requires what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to imagine what another person is feeling and to be emotionally affected by that imagining. Children develop this capacity through secure attachment relationships where their own emotions are recognized, validated, and responded to with care. When a child's emotions are instead ignored, dismissed, or enjoyed by their abusers, when their pain becomes someone else's pleasure, the neural pathways that support empathy can fail to develop properly. Eddie's abusers weren't just hurting him. Through their actions, they were teaching him, at a fundamental level, that other people's pain doesn't matter, that violating someone weaker is acceptable, that power justifies any action. A child subjected to these lessons consistently may internalize them not consciously, but at a level so deep it becomes part of how they perceive all future relationships. Sexual impulse control is another crucial factor. Normal sexual development involves learning to manage sexual feelings in socially appropriate ways, to delay gratification, to seek consensual adult partners, to distinguish between sexual thoughts and sexual actions. This learning happens through a combination of neurological maturation and social teaching, watching how adults model healthy relationships, receiving age-appropriate education about boundaries and consent. But when a child's sexuality is hijacked by abusers before normal development can occur, when sex is associated with violence and violation from the very beginning, the entire developmental framework becomes distorted. For Eddie, sex would never have been about mutual pleasure or intimate connection. From his earliest sexual experiences, it was about power, about someone having absolute control over him, using that power to violate him, and him being completely helpless to stop it. This creates an association at a neurological level that becomes incredibly difficult to rewrite later. Sex equals power differential. Sex equals control. Sex equals the domination of someone weaker. When Eddie eventually developed his own sexual urges, they would have been channeled through this distorted framework. He wouldn't have learned to seek equal, consenting partners because his template for sexuality had nothing to do with equality or consent. His sexual feelings would have been entangled with needs for control, with rage at his own past powerlessness, with a desperate desire to reverse the dynamic of his childhood by becoming the one with power instead of the one being violated. There's a psychological defense mechanism that trauma researchers call identification with the aggressor, and it's one of the darkest pathways from victimization to perpetration. This mechanism emerges when victims, unable to escape or fight their abusers, instead psychologically align themselves with the abuser's perspective as a way of managing terror. The logic, insofar as there is logic in these unconscious processes, goes something like this. If I can't stop the person hurting me, maybe I can become like them. If I take on their attitudes, their behaviors, their worldview, then I won't be the helpless victim anymore. I'll be the powerful one. I'll be safe. This doesn't happen through conscious choice. A child doesn't sit down and decide to identify with their abuser. It's an automatic psychological survival strategy that the mind employs when trapped in inescapable threat, a desperate attempt to gain some sense of control in a situation defined by absolute powerlessness. Children who identify with their aggressors begin to mirror the aggressor's attitudes and behaviors. They internalize the aggressor's contempt for weakness, the aggressor's justifications for violence, the aggressor's view of other people as objects to be used, rather than as human beings with their own autonomy and feelings. Over time, this identification can become woven into the child's core identity, shaping who they become as adults. Eddie's later behavior suggests this dynamic was operating in his psyche. His victims before Mount Massive were women, and his violence toward them was specifically gendered. He mutilated them, which points to attacks on their bodies that went far beyond what would be necessary to simply kill someone. This suggests profound misogyny, a hatred and contempt for women that likely had roots in his childhood trauma. If Eddie's mother was aware of the abuse and did nothing to stop it, that would have taught him that women are either complicit in male violence or too weak to prevent it, that they can't be trusted to protect, that they deserve punishment for their failure to intervene. Alternatively, if Eddie had positive feelings toward his mother or other female figures in his early life, their failure to save him might have transformed those feelings into rage. Why didn't you protect me? Why did you let this happen? Why were you weak when I needed you to be strong? There's another dimension to Eddie's choice of female victims, one that becomes clear when we see what he does in the vocational block. He wasn't just killing women. He was searching for something, trying to create something, attempting to find or build the perfect bride who would love him unconditionally, who would never betray or abandon him, who would give him the family and intimacy he'd been denied. When each woman inevitably failed to meet this impossible standard, because no real person can be someone else's fantasy made flesh, he punished them for that failure through mutilation and murder. This pattern aligns with what forensic psychologists classify as mission-oriented serial killing, where the perpetrator kills according to specific, internal logic or purpose rather than random opportunity. Eddie had a vision, a goal He was looking for something he could never find because it didn't exist. A perfect partner who would heal the wounds of his childhood, who would love the broken parts of him without question or condition, who would never hurt or leave him. Each failure to find this impossible ideal would have intensified his rage and desperation, creating a compulsive cycle. The next one will be right. The next one will be perfect. I just have to keep trying, keep searching, keep killing until I find her. The mutilation aspect is particularly significant from a psychological perspective. Many serial killers who mutilate their victims are attempting to literally reshape them into something other than what they are, exercising absolute control over another person's body in a way that reverses the dynamic of their own victimization. When Eddie was a child, his body was violated and controlled by others. He had no agency, no power, no ability to stop what was being done to him. As an adult perpetrator, he became the one with absolute power. His victims were helpless, just as he had been. Their bodies were his to reshape, just as trauma had reshaped his psyche. The mutilation wasn't random violence or simple sadism. It was a reenactment of his own trauma with the roles reversed, a desperate and distorted attempt to master that original helplessness by taking the aggressor's position. This is perhaps the darkest truth about some trauma survivors who become perpetrators. They're not simply repeating what was done to them in some mechanical way. They're attempting to resolve the trauma by reversing the power dynamic, by doing to others what was done to them, by proving to themselves that they're no longer the powerless child who couldn't fight back. But this strategy never works. The trauma doesn't heal through reenactment. The void doesn't fill through violence. Each act of perpetration actually deepens the pathology, reinforces the distorted frameworks, drives the person further from any possibility of genuine healing, and creates fresh trauma that layers on top of the original wounds. By the time Eddie was caught and committed to Mount Massive Asylum, he was already profoundly damaged. He had killed multiple women. He had developed a delusional system around his murders, framing them not as crimes, but as a search for love. He had lost, or perhaps never possessed, the ability to see other people as fully human, with their own autonomy and right to safety. He was likely dissociative, certainly misogynistic, violent, and operating according to an internal reality that had only tangential connection to objective truth. A competent psychiatric facility with ethical treatment protocols might have recognized these patterns. They might have provided intensive trauma-focused therapy specifically designed for perpetrators with abuse histories, medication to manage any psychotic symptoms if they were present, and secure containment to protect the public while treatment was attempted. Eddie would likely never have been capable of fully recovering given the severity of his pathology, but ethical treatment would have at least tried to address his trauma history while maintaining public safety and treating him with basic human dignity. Mount Massive Asylum was not that kind of facility. It presented itself to the public as a private psychiatric hospital where the severely mentally ill could receive treatment in a secure environment. But this was a carefully maintained fiction. The asylum was owned and operated by the Murkoff Corporation, and what happened within its walls had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with experimentation. What Murkoff did to Eddie Gluskin didn't help him. It shattered what little humanity remained and transformed him into something that barely qualified as human anymore. Mount Massive served as a testing ground for something called the morphogenic engine, a piece of technology derived from Nazi-era research conducted by a scientist named Rudolf Wernicke. The science behind it mixes real concepts from neurology and nanotechnology with speculative elements, but the core premise is clear enough. Murkoff was attempting to create the Wall Rider, a swarm of nanomachines that could be controlled by a human host to function as a living weapon. To control this swarm, they needed test subjects, people whose minds could interface with the nanotechnology, who could maintain their sense of self while their consciousness expanded to encompass thousands of individual microscopic components. The morphogenic engine was the interface device, and what it did to patients was torture disguised as therapy. Subjects were placed inside pod-like chambers and exposed to intense psychological and neurological stimulation. The stated goal was inducing lucid dreaming states where the subject's consciousness could practice controlling the nanomachine swarm. The actual result was prolonged sensory deprivation, forced hallucinations, chemical restraints, and psychological trauma deliberately designed to break down the subject's existing sense of reality and rebuild it according to parameters that might make them suitable hosts for the Wall Rider. Eddie Gluskin was one of these test subjects, and we see him briefly in the opening sequence of Whistleblower, struggling against guards as they force him toward the morphogenic engine chamber. He's terrified, fighting with the desperation of someone who knows what's about to happen and will do anything to avoid it. The guards overpower him and seal him inside. What happens next isn't shown directly, but we can infer it from documents scattered throughout the game and from Eddie's psychological state when we encounter him later in the vocational block. The experiments involved extreme sensory manipulation. Patients experienced hallucinations, visions, and altered states of consciousness that researchers attempted to guide toward specific outcomes. For someone like Eddie, who already had a tenuous grip on reality due to his trauma history and existing pathology, this would have been psychologically catastrophic. His delusions wouldn't have been treated or managed. They would have been amplified, redirected, potentially weaponized for Murkoff's purposes. One document suggests that Eddie claimed to hear the Wall Rider speaking to him. The asylum's doctors dismissed this as psychotic delusion, which, from their clinical perspective, made sense given that the Wall Rider was supposedly just a nano-machine swarm without consciousness, or the ability to communicate. But multiple patients reported similar experiences, which suggests that exposure to the morphogenic engine created some kind of psychological phenomenon, whether actual connection to the project, shared hallucination induced by similar experimental protocols, or the patient's damaged minds interpreting the engine's effects as communication. Whether the Wall Rider actually spoke to Eddie or whether his psyche was fragmenting under the experiments is less important than the fact that Eddie believed it, and that belief shaped his subsequent behavior and deepened his disconnection from reality. The effects of prolonged exposure to the morphogenic engine would have overlapped with and dramatically worsened Eddie's existing trauma responses. Sensory deprivation is a well-documented form of torture that produces hallucinations, paranoia, and dissociation even in previously healthy individuals. Studies of prisoners held in solitary confinement show measurable psychological deterioration after just days or weeks. For someone like Eddie, who already had trauma-induced dissociative tendencies from childhood abuse, sensory deprivation would have been like pouring gasoline on embers. His ability to distinguish reality from fantasy, already compromised by his delusional system around finding a perfect bride, would have deteriorated even further under conditions specifically designed to blur those boundaries. The enforced lucid dreaming states are particularly insidious from a psychological perspective. Lucid dreaming, where the dreamer is aware they're dreaming and can exert some control over the dream's content, is usually a benign phenomenon that some people experience naturally or train themselves to achieve through various techniques. But forced, Prolonged lucid dreaming in a controlled experimental context is something entirely different and far more dangerous. The subject becomes trapped in a state where they know nothing is real but can't escape, where they're aware of the artificiality of their experience but still subjected to intense emotional and sensory input that feels genuine. Over time, being held in this twilight state for hours or days, the boundary between dreaming and waking reality begins to erode. If you spend enough time conscious but existing in states where nothing around you is real, your brain starts losing the ability to trust that waking reality is any more solid or reliable than the dream states. For Eddie, whose entire sense of self and reality was already built on foundations damaged by childhood trauma, this erosion of boundaries would have been devastating. His delusions about finding a perfect bride, about creating a family, about transforming his victims into acceptable partners. These weren't just fantasies he entertained occasionally. They became his reality, the framework he lived inside continuously, and the morphogenic engine experiments made it impossible for him to recognize or challenge that framework from any external perspective. There's also the physical trauma of the experiments themselves. Patients were forcibly restrained, medicated against their will, subjected to procedures without meaningful consent. For Eddie, this mirrored his childhood abuse in ways that would have been re-traumatizing on a profound level. Being physically overpowered, having things done to his body against his will, being told that what's happening is for his own good or serves some larger purpose, when it's actually just torture dressed up as treatment. All of this echoed the dynamics of his original abuse. The morphogenic engine experiments didn't just damage Eddie further, they triggered constant flashbacks to his childhood, reinforced the neurological patterns created by that early trauma, and taught him once again that he was powerless, that his autonomy didn't matter, that others would use his body for their purposes regardless of his suffering. One of the cruelest aspects of Murkoff's approach was the intermittent positive reinforcement, giving patients false hope to keep them compliant. Documents suggest that researchers told Eddie he was making progress, that he was close to being cured and potentially released. This is a classic manipulation tactic seen in both cults and abusive relationships. Occasional positive feedback keeps the victim hoping, keeps them trying to please their abusers, keeps them believing that if they just cooperate a little more, if they just succeed at the next test, maybe the torture will stop and they'll get what they've been promised. Eddie would have clung to these promises desperately. After everything he'd been through, the idea that he might be cured, that he might leave the asylum and have a chance at the normal life and family he'd been searching for, would have been irresistible. So he would have tried to cooperate with the experiments, endured the torture, convinced himself that it was treatment rather than abuse. But there was never going to be a cure because Murkoff wasn't trying to heal Eddie. They were trying to use him to shape his broken mind into something that could serve their purposes as a wall rider host. When he failed to become suitable, when his consciousness couldn't maintain coherence while interfacing with the nanomachine swarm, he wasn't released or given actual treatment. He was simply kept, warehoused in the asylum as a failed experiment, his deteriorating mental state no longer of interest to the people who had deliberately worsened it. This is where we need to understand how institutional abuse amplifies existing pathology. Eddie arrived at Mount Massive already damaged and dangerous, but he had to have retained some minimal connection to reality and functionality in the external world, because otherwise he couldn't have operated as a serial killer across multiple victims, evading detection long enough to accumulate a body count. He had enough awareness to be caught by law enforcement. to go through legal proceedings to be committed to the asylum rather than simply disappearing into Murkoff's programs directly. What the morphogenic engine experiments did was systematically destroy that remaining functionality. They took a man already struggling with reality and subjected him to experiences specifically designed to dissolve the boundaries between real and unreal, self and other, waking and dreaming. They re-traumatized him in ways that echoed his original abuse. They gave him false hope and then betrayed it repeatedly. They isolated him from any genuine human connection, ensuring that all his interactions were with guards who restrained him, doctors who experimented on him, or other patients who were equally trapped and deteriorating. In trauma psychology, there's a concept called complex PTSD that develops from prolonged, inescapable trauma where the victim has no control and no ability to escape. This is distinct from PTSD resulting from a single traumatic event like a car accident or assault. Complex PTSD, a term coined by trauma researcher Judith Herman, involves pervasive changes to personality, emotional regulation, self-concept, and the capacity for relationships. It's a disorder of captivity. What happens to prisoners of war held for years, survivors of long-term domestic violence, victims of sustained childhood abuse, people trapped in situations where trauma becomes the constant backdrop of existence. Eddie developed complex PTSD from his childhood sexual abuse, and then as an adult he was subjected to another prolonged captivity situation at Mount Massive. The morphogenic engine experiments created a second layer of complex trauma overlaid on the first. His personality, already fractured and reorganized around his early abuse, fractured further into something barely recognizable. His emotional regulation, already compromised, deteriorated into rapid cycling between romantic tenderness and explosive violence. His self-concept, built around a delusional narrative of finding perfect love through violent control, became even more rigid and divorced from reality because the experiments had destroyed his remaining capacity for self-reflection or critical examination of his own thoughts. By the time the Mount Massive incident occurred on September 17th, 2013, when a patient named Billy Hope finally succeeded in controlling the wall rider and used it to tear through the facility, killing staff and freeing other patients, Eddie Gluskin was no longer the man who had entered the asylum. He wasn't even the serial killer who had been committed there. He was something the asylum had created through systematic torture and negligence, a compound of his original childhood trauma, his pre-existing pathology, and the fresh horrors Murkoff had inflicted on him in the name of research and corporate profit. When the chaos erupted and the variants escaped containment, Eddie didn't run for the exits. He didn't try to leave Mount Massive and disappear into the world outside. Instead, he claimed territory, staking out the vocational block as his personal domain, a section of the facility with workshops, a gymnasium, and enough space to finally build what he'd been dreaming of throughout his imprisonment. He had freedom now, real freedom for the first time since his admission, and he used that freedom not to escape, but to pursue his delusion without interference. The vocational block became the physical manifestation of Eddie's internal reality, and when Wayland Park stumbles into that space, he walks into a nightmare that couldn't exist if we didn't understand everything that had brought Eddie to that point. The vocational block is where Eddie Gluskin's fractured psyche becomes visible, where his delusions stop being internal thoughts and become external reality, reshaping the environment around him. The walls are decorated with wedding imagery, hearts, and flowers, and romantic phrases that might be written in paint or might be written in blood. It's hard to tell, and maybe that ambiguity is intentional. The gymnasium has been converted into a grotesque wedding venue with bodies hanging from the ceiling like decorations, each one a failed bride who didn't meet Eddie's standards, each one evidence of an attempt to force reality to conform to fantasy. To understand what Eddie has created here, we need to understand the specific nature of his delusion and how it functions psychologically. He's not killing randomly or torturing for simple sadistic pleasure, though sadism is certainly present in his actions. He's operating according to internal logic that makes perfect sense to him, even as it's completely detached from objective reality. In his mind, he's preparing for a wedding. He's searching for the perfect bride. He's going to create a family, have children, build the life that was stolen from him in childhood and that he's been chasing ever since. This is what psychologists call a reconstructive delusion, an attempt to use fantasy to repair damage that fundamentally cannot be repaired through fantasy. Eddie never had a safe childhood. He never experienced healthy love. He never learned what genuine intimacy looks like or feels like. His only templates for relationships are the abuse he suffered and the idealized images that culture presents in media, romance movies, and wedding magazines, and sanitized versions of love and family that bear no relation to the traumatized reality of his actual life. He's trying to force reality to conform to those idealized templates. And when reality refuses, when his brides scream or fight or die before he can complete his fantasy, he simply tries again with a new victim. The bodies in the gymnasium tell this story. Each one represents an attempt that failed, a bride who wasn't perfect, who Eddie tried to correct through surgical mutilation, and who died in the process or was killed when they failed to measure up to his impossible standards. Multiple bodies hang from the ceiling and litter the space, which raises immediate questions about timeline. The Mount Massive incident happened on the night of September 17th. Wayland Park's journey through the vocational block occurs during that same night or the early morning hours of September 18th. How did Eddie accumulate so many victims so quickly? Several possibilities exist. Eddie may have had access to the vocational block before the main incident, using it as hunting grounds during the period when Murkoff's security was focused on the morphogenic engine experiments rather than carefully monitoring patient movements within supposedly secure areas. The timeline might also be longer than it appears, since game narratives compress time for gameplay purposes, and what feels like a single night might represent a longer period in the fiction. Or, most disturbingly, Eddie's surgical modifications may have been performed rapidly and carelessly without any concern for the victim's survival during the procedure, allowing him to work through victims much faster than if he were attempting to keep them alive through the surgeries. Regardless of the specific timeline, the vocational block represents Eddie's complete break with external reality and his total immersion in delusional fantasy. He's created a space where his internal logic is the only logic that matters, where he can pursue his impossible goal without interference from authority figures, or rules, or reality itself. This is his world now, restructured to match the architecture of his damaged psyche. His behavior when he encounters Wayland Park is entirely consistent with this delusional framework. When Eddie first sees Wayland, he doesn't recognize him as another trapped patient or a man desperately trying to escape the asylum. He sees a potential bride. The fact that Wayland is male should disqualify him from Eddie's stated goal of finding a female partner, but Eddie's delusion has evolved to accommodate this obstacle. He can make Wayland into a woman through surgery. He can physically modify his victim's body to match his fantasy, transforming male anatomy into something that approximates female anatomy well enough to satisfy Eddie's distorted requirements. This adaptation reveals something crucial about the nature of Eddie's delusion. It's not actually about finding a biological woman. It's about finding someone he can completely control, someone he can reshape literally and figuratively into his ideal. Gender becomes secondary to compliance, to malleability, to the victim's inability to resist Eddie's transformation of them into whatever he needs them to be. Women were likely his initial targets because culturally women are presented as appropriate romantic partners for men, and Eddie was attempting to follow that social script. But once the vocational block became his domain, and his available victim pool consisted primarily of male inmates, his delusion adapted with disturbing flexibility. He would create brides from whatever material was available, and if that meant surgically altering men, then that's what he would do. This adaptability is actually characteristic of certain delusional disorders. The core delusion remains fixed and unshakable, but the details surrounding that delusion can shift to accommodate changing circumstances. This is different from the more chaotic delusions seen in conditions like schizophrenia. Eddie's delusion is remarkably coherent within its own framework. He has a clear goal, a specific method, and a defined sense of what he's trying to achieve. The fact that all of it is impossible and monstrous doesn't make it incoherent from his subjective perspective. His dialogue throughout the vocational block sequence reveals this internal coherence with disturbing clarity. He speaks to Waylon as if they're already in a relationship, using pet names and romantic language that would be appropriate between loving partners, but becomes grotesque in this context. Darling, he calls him. He speaks about their future together, about the children they'll have, about the wedding they're preparing for. When Waylon resists or tries to escape, Eddie's tone shifts to hurt and anger. Not the anger of a predator whose prey is escaping, but the wounded anger of a partner who feels betrayed by someone they love. Why are you doing this? He asks, genuinely confused by Waylon's unwillingness to participate in the fantasy, unable to comprehend that Waylon might have his own desires that don't align with Eddie's plans. This reveals Eddie's profound inability to recognize other people's autonomy or separate existence. In Eddie's mind, Waylon should want to be his bride because Eddie wants him to be. The idea that Waylon has his own goals, his own identity, his own horror at what's being done to him, none of that registers as real or important. Other people exist in Eddie's world only as they relate to his needs and desires. They're not separate beings with their own internal lives and rights. They're supporting characters in Eddie's story, and when they refuse to play their assigned roles, he interprets that refusal as a personal betrayal deserving of punishment. This goes beyond standard narcissism or selfishness. Eddie has a fundamental deficit in what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have separate perspectives, feelings, and experiences. Children typically develop theory of mind through healthy interaction with caregivers who model empathy and perspective taking, who show the child that other people's feelings matter and should influence our behavior. Eddie's caregivers instead modeled the opposite, that other people exist to be used, that their suffering is irrelevant, that power justifies any violation. This became Eddie's operating template for all relationships, and nothing in his subsequent life, including the morphogenic engine experiments, corrected this fundamental deficit. If anything, those experiments made it worse by further isolating him from genuine human connection and reinforcing his solipsistic worldview. The surgical element of Eddie's activities is particularly horrifying and carries multiple layers of psychological meaning. He's performing forced gender reassignment surgeries on his victims, crudely feminizing their bodies through procedures that no actual surgeon would ever perform. These aren't medical interventions designed to help patients. They're mutilations designed to reshape victims into Eddie's fantasy, regardless of the cost in suffering or life. First, this is a literal reenactment of his own bodily violation. Eddie was sexually abused, which involved his body being used without his consent for his abuser's purposes. Now he's doing the same to his victims, using their bodies without consent, reshaping them to serve his purposes. The roles have reversed, but the fundamental dynamic remains identical. The powerless has become powerful. The victim has become victimizer, but the underlying pattern of violation continues. Second, it's an expression of absolute control. Gender is one of the most fundamental aspects of human identity. By forcibly changing his victim's gender presentation and physical characteristics, Eddie is attacking their core sense of self, attempting to destroy who they are and replace it with who he needs them to be. This is psychological annihilation layered on top of physical torture. Third, it reveals the depth of Eddie's dissociation from physical reality. Real surgery requires sterile environments, anesthesia, specific instruments, extensive anatomical knowledge, and years of training. Eddie has none of these. His surgeries are being performed in a gymnasium with improvised tools, no anesthesia beyond physical restraints, and no regard for infection, blood loss, shock, or the fact that most of his victims are dying during or immediately after the procedures. He's acting out a fantasy of surgical transformation while completely ignoring the brutal physical reality of what he's actually doing, which is torturing people to death. He sees himself as creating beauty, preparing brides, but the objective reality is mutilation and murder. The wedding imagery decorating the space reinforces this dissociative quality. Eddie has transformed his hunting ground into what he perceives as a romantic venue because, in his mind, that's genuinely what it is. The blood and bodies aren't evidence of horror to him. They're failures, attempts that didn't work out, problems he's still trying to solve. The next bride will be the right one. The next surgery will succeed. He just has to keep trying, keep refining his technique, keep searching for that perfect partner who will finally make his delusion real and give him the life he's been chasing since childhood. This is obsessive thinking taken to its absolute extreme. Obsessions are characterized by repetitive, intrusive thoughts that the person feels compelled to act on despite negative consequences. Most people experience mild obsessions occasionally, repeatedly checking if the door is locked or worrying about specific scenarios. But they maintain enough reality testing to eventually recognize when their behavior has become excessive or irrational. Eddie has lost that reality testing capacity entirely. His obsession with finding a perfect bride has consumed his entire existence, become the singular organizing principle of his psyche, and nothing can penetrate the closed loop of his delusional thinking. Not the bodies piling up, not his victim's screams and pleas, not the objective impossibility of his goal. Nothing breaks through because he's no longer connected to external reality in any meaningful way. When Waylon finally confronts Eddie in the gymnasium's upper catwalks, when the pursuit reaches its climax, the confrontation doesn't end with Eddie being defeated or captured or suddenly gaining insight into his delusion. Instead, Eddie dies by accident, impaled when he lunges at Waylon and loses his balance, falling onto equipment below. Even in his final moments as he's dying, Eddie doesn't recognize the reality of what's happened or what he's done. His last words to Waylon are delivered with genuine tenderness. "You were so beautiful," he says, as if they'd shared a real relationship rather than a predator-prey dynamic, as if the horror of the previous hours had been courtship rather than torture. Eddie dies inside his delusion, never breaking free of it, never gaining even a moment of clarity or insight into what he actually was or what he actually did. This might be the most tragic element of his entire character arc. He was never going to recover. The combination of childhood trauma, existing pathology, and institutional torture had destroyed any possibility of genuine insight or healing. His death becomes almost merciful compared to the alternative, continued existence trapped forever in a delusion that could never be fulfilled, surrounded by endless evidence of his own monstrosity, unable to recognize or comprehend any of it. If we step back and try to understand Eddie Gluskin through clinical diagnostic frameworks using criteria from the DSM-5, we're looking at an extraordinarily complex presentation involving multiple overlapping disorders. Diagnosing fictional characters is inherently speculative, and real clinical diagnosis requires extensive evaluation that obviously isn't possible here. But examining Eddie's presentation through these frameworks helps illuminate the psychological mechanisms driving his behavior. Eddie almost certainly would meet criteria for complex PTSD resulting from childhood sexual abuse. Complex PTSD isn't officially in the DSM-5 as a separate diagnosis. It appears instead in the ICD-11, but it's widely recognized clinically. The condition develops from prolonged, inescapable trauma and includes core PTSD symptoms like intrusive memories, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and avoidance, plus additional features like severe emotional dysregulation, negative self-concept, and profoundly disturbed relationships. Eddie's violence toward women can be understood partly as trauma reenactment, compulsively recreating dynamics from his abuse with roles reversed. The morphogenic engine experiments would have created a second layer of complex trauma overlaid on the first, intensifying all these symptoms. Eddie also displays what appears to be a persistent delusion, the fixed belief that he can and will find or create his perfect bride and build a family. His delusion is organized and consistent, which distinguishes it from the more chaotic thinking seen in conditions like schizophrenia. He's built an entire belief system around this central idea, and all his actions are directed toward fulfilling this delusional goal. However, the severity of his additional symptoms, his violence, and profound reality distortion suggests the delusion might be better understood as one symptom of more pervasive pathology rather than a standalone delusional disorder. Eddie's pre-asylum history as a serial killer who mutilated women certainly warrants consideration of antisocial personality disorder. He shows pervasive disregard for others' rights, failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness, aggressiveness, reckless disregard for others' safety, and apparent lack of remorse. However, diagnosing personality disorders in severe trauma survivors is complicated because many of these symptoms might be better understood as trauma sequelae rather than primary personality pathology. Eddie's lack of empathy and antisocial behavior developed in the context of severe childhood abuse, which changes how we should conceptualize these traits. Some of Eddie's symptoms also align with borderline personality disorder, particularly his frantic efforts to avoid abandonment through his desperate search for a perfect partner. His unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by rapid idealization and devaluation of his brides, his identity disturbance visible in his confused gender dynamics, and inability to maintain a coherent sense of self, his impulsivity, his emotional instability with inappropriate intense anger, and his chronic feelings of emptiness that he tries to fill through his delusional romantic fantasy. Borderline personality disorder is strongly associated with childhood trauma, particularly sexual abuse, and many clinicians view it as a complex trauma response rather than a distinct personality disorder. Eddie's presentation could be understood as severe borderline pathology with psychotic features. Eddie's reality testing is so profoundly impaired that dissociative disorders must be considered. We don't see clear evidence of dissociative identity disorder with distinct alternate personalities, but other dissociative features are unmistakably present. He experiences depersonalization, a sense of detachment from his own body and mental processes. He shows derealization, experiencing the external world as unreal or dreamlike. His ability to engage in horrific violence while maintaining a romantic, gentle demeanor suggests profound compartmentalization. He can carve up a victim while talking tenderly about love and marriage because some part of his mind has completely separated the physical reality of what he's doing from the fantasy narrative he's experiencing. The morphogenic engine experiments, with their enforced lucid dreaming and sensory manipulation, would have dramatically worsened any pre-existing dissociative tendencies until Eddie may have lost the ability to reliably distinguish between what's real and what's fantasy, between waking and dreaming, between self and other. His profound delusion, possible hallucinations like hearing the wall rider speak, and complete break with consensual reality suggest a psychotic disorder. Though his presentation doesn't look like typical schizophrenia, he doesn't exhibit disorganized speech or behavior. His actions are highly organized around his delusional goal, and we don't see clear evidence of negative symptoms like flat affect. His presentation is more consistent with what used to be called paranoid schizophrenia before the DSM-5 removed subtypes, or possibly a mood disorder with psychotic features, or even brief psychotic disorder triggered by extreme stress. The DSM-5 includes sexual sadism disorder, defined as intense sexual arousal from the physical or psychological suffering of another person persisting over at least 6 months. Eddie's mutilation of victims, his forcing them into sexual scenarios, and his apparent arousal during his bride preparation activities suggest this diagnosis might apply. However, it's unclear how much of Eddie's violence is actually sexually motivated versus being driven by his delusional need to create a perfect partner. Sexual sadism typically involves deriving pleasure from the act of inflicting pain itself, whereas Eddie seems more focused on the end result of having a perfect bride than on the process of torture. His violence might be instrumental, a means to an end, rather than consummatory, an end in itself. The reality is that Eddie Gluskin doesn't fit neatly into any single diagnostic category. He likely meets criteria for multiple disorders simultaneously, what clinicians call comorbidity, which is actually quite common in real clinical practice, especially with trauma survivors who develop complex pathology. A more accurate formulation might be complex PTSD from childhood sexual abuse, with extensive dissociative features, severe personality disorder with antisocial, borderline, and narcissistic traits, best understood as post-traumatic personality reorganization, delusional disorder, or psychotic disorder, not otherwise specified, with grandiose and persecutory themes. Possible sexual sadism disorder, though difficult to distinguish from trauma reenactment, and severe cognitive distortion and reality testing impairment worsened dramatically by morphogenic engine experiments. This combination of disorders created a perfect storm of pathology, where Eddie's already fragile connection to reality, empathy, and impulse control were systematically destroyed, leaving someone who was profoundly dangerous, entirely delusional, and completely beyond the reach of conventional therapeutic intervention. One of the most disturbing aspects of Eddie Gluskin's story isn't what he did, horrific as his actions were, but what was done to him in the name of treatment. This raises profound ethical questions about psychiatric care, patient rights, and institutional responsibility that extend far beyond the fictional world of Outlast into real concerns about how we treat the severely mentally ill, particularly those who have committed violent crimes. Eddie was admitted to Mount Massive Asylum as someone who needed help. Yes, he was dangerous. Yes, he had killed people. Yes, he posed a significant risk to public safety. But the purpose of psychiatric commitment, even for violent offenders, is supposed to be treatment and rehabilitation where possible, and secure containment to protect the public when treatment fails. The goal should be attempting to address the underlying pathology while maintaining human dignity and adhering to ethical treatment standards. What happened to Eddie at Mount Massive was the opposite of ethical treatment. It was systematic torture disguised as therapy, and it made him dramatically worse. The morphogenic engine experiments violated every principle of medical ethics. Informed consent, the foundational requirement that patients must understand and agree to treatment before it's administered, was completely absent. Eddie couldn't consent to being a test subject for experimental technology designed to interface his consciousness with nano-machine swarms. He didn't understand what was being done to him or why. He was simply subjected to these procedures through force, restrained by guards, and placed in the engine regardless of his terror or resistance. The principle of beneficence that medical treatment should be intended to help the patient was inverted. The experiments weren't designed to treat Eddie's trauma or manage his violent impulses or address his delusional thinking. They were designed to use him to see if his consciousness could be shaped into a suitable host for the wall rider. His well-being was irrelevant. He was a tool, a test subject, a means to an end that had nothing to do with his recovery or health. The principle of non-maleficence, first do no harm, was obliterated. The morphogenic engine experiments caused direct, measurable harm. They worsened Eddie's dissociation, intensified his delusions, eroded his remaining reality testing, and re-traumatized him in ways that echoed his childhood abuse. Murkoff knew the experiments were harmful. Documents throughout the game make clear that researchers understood patients were deteriorating psychologically. They simply didn't care because the research goals took precedence over patient welfare. In real psychiatric care, there are supposed to be multiple layers of oversight preventing this kind of abuse. Institutional review boards evaluate research protocols to ensure they're ethical. Patient advocates monitor treatment to protect vulnerable individuals. External regulatory agencies inspect facilities and investigate complaints. Mental health professionals are bound by ethical codes that require prioritizing patient welfare even when working with dangerous or difficult patients. Mount Massive had none of these protections, or more accurately, it had the appearance of these protections as a facade, while the reality was completely different. Murkoff's corporate structure and carefully maintained public image allowed the asylum to operate with impunity, torturing patients under the guise of cutting-edge psychiatric treatment. This connects to real historical atrocities in psychiatric care. The Nazi experiments that Rudolf Wernicke supposedly conducted, which formed the basis for the morphogenic engine technology, are directly referenced in the game as a reminder that using human beings as experimental subjects without consent isn't fictional horror, but historical reality. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where black men were deliberately left untreated for syphilis, without their knowledge so researchers could study the disease's progression, continued for 40 years in the United States. MK Ultra, the CIA's mind control experiments, subjected unwitting participants to LSD, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture throughout the 1950s and 60s. These aren't ancient history or foreign atrocities. They happened in living memory in supposedly advanced nations with supposedly rigorous ethical standards. What makes Eddie Gluskin's story particularly tragic is that he never had a chance. He entered the world in a situation where the people meant to protect him instead violated him repeatedly, damaging his developing brain and psyche in ways that made normal development nearly impossible. The abuse created pathology that eventually manifested as violence toward others, which should have resulted in secure treatment attempting to address both his dangerousness and the underlying trauma driving that dangerousness. Instead, he was committed to a facility that used him as an experimental subject, subjected him to further trauma, and made his pathology exponentially worse. By the time the Mount Massive incident gave him freedom to act on his delusions, he was so far gone that death became the only possible ending to his story. There's a broader question here about responsibility and culpability. Eddie Gluskin committed horrific crimes. He murdered women before Mount Massive and murdered inmates within the asylum. He tortured people, mutilated them, subjected them to unimaginable suffering in pursuit of his delusional goals. He's a monster by any reasonable definition, but he's also a victim, someone who was systematically destroyed by abuse and institutional cruelty until the person he might have been was completely obliterated. Can both things be true simultaneously? Can someone be both perpetrator and victim? The answer has to be yes, uncomfortable as that is. Eddie is responsible for his actions in the sense that he made choices, wielded weapons, inflicted pain and death. His victims suffered regardless of his psychological state, and their suffering matters. But he's also a product of circumstances beyond his control, shaped by childhood trauma he didn't choose and institutional abuse he couldn't prevent. His damaged brain, his fractured psyche, his delusional thinking, none of these were things he deliberately created. They were done to him by others, by his abusers in childhood, and by Murkoff's researchers in adulthood. This doesn't excuse his crimes or diminish the horror of what he did. It contextualizes them, helps us understand the pathway from victimization to perpetration, and reminds us that creating monsters is often a collaborative process involving multiple failures across years or decades. Eddie's father and uncle created the initial damage. The systems that failed to detect or intervene in his abuse allowed that damage to deepen. Whatever happened between his childhood and his first murders, whether lack of access to mental health care or inability to seek help due to shame and dissociation or simple bad luck, allowed his pathology to develop unchecked. Law enforcement and the courts that committed him to Mount Massive instead of a secure psychiatric facility with genuine treatment protocols handed him to Murkoff. And Murkoff's deliberate torture in the name of research completed his transformation into the nightmare that Wayland Park encountered. If we want to prevent future Eddie Gluskins, real or fictional, we need to address every point in this chain. We need better detection and intervention for child abuse. We need trauma-informed mental health care accessible to survivors before their damage manifests as violence toward others. We need secure psychiatric facilities that actually treat patients rather than warehousing or abusing them. We need oversight and accountability for institutions that claim to provide mental health care. We need to recognize that creating safe Ethical treatment environments for dangerous, mentally ill individuals isn't just compassion, it's public safety, because people like Eddie become more dangerous when they're tortured than when they're actually treated. The vocational block stands as a monument to institutional failure. Every body hanging from that gymnasium ceiling represents not just Eddie's crimes, but society's collective failure to protect him as a child, treat him as a patient, and prevent his transformation into a killer. This doesn't absolve him of responsibility. It indicts the systems that created the conditions for his pathology to flourish. What Eddie Gluskin wanted, at the core of all his delusions and violence, was something heartbreakingly simple. He wanted to be loved. He wanted family. He wanted the childhood he never had, the safety he never experienced, the intimate connection that was stolen from him before he could even understand what was being taken. These are universal human needs, things everyone deserves, and Eddie's tragedy is that his attempts to fulfill these needs were so warped by trauma that they became monstrous. He couldn't seek love, so he tried to create it by force. He couldn't build family, so he tried to carve it from unwilling victims. He couldn't experience safety, so he tried to construct an environment of absolute control where nothing could hurt him, because he held all the power. None of this worked because it couldn't work. Love created through force isn't love. Family built from mutilated victims isn't family. Safety purchased through absolute control is isolation, not security. Eddie spent his entire life chasing something he could never catch because trauma had destroyed his ability to recognize or accept it even if it appeared. If someone had genuinely tried to love him, tried to offer real intimacy and connection, his damaged psyche wouldn't have been able to receive it. He would have tested it, pushed against it, ultimately destroyed it because his internal template for relationships was built entirely from abuse and abandonment. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of severe trauma pathology. It doesn't just damage the person in the moment, it damages their future capacity for healing, creates self-perpetuating cycles where the very thing the person needs most becomes a thing their psyche rejects or destroys. Eddie needed love but couldn't accept it. He needed safety, but his hypervigilance prevented trust. He needed connection, but his lack of empathy made genuine connection impossible. The abuse created needs that the abuse made impossible to fulfill, trapping him in a loop of desperate seeking and inevitable failure that could only end in violence and death. When Eddie falls to his death in the gymnasium, impaled on equipment below, his final words to Waylon about beauty and perfection, there's a moment where you might almost feel something like pity. Not sympathy exactly, because his crimes are too horrific for sympathy. Not forgiveness, because what he did can't be forgiven. But pity, the recognition that this broken thing dying on rusted metal was once a child who deserved protection and love and safety, and that child was destroyed so thoroughly that by adulthood nothing remained except damage and delusion. The game doesn't ask you to forgive Eddie Gluskin. It doesn't present him as secretly good or redeemable. He's a monster, and the game knows it, and Waylon's terror fleeing from him is completely justified. But the game also gives you enough context, enough fragments of Eddie's history, enough glimpses into his fractured psyche that you can understand how monsters are made. You can see the pathway from victimization to perpetration, from childhood abuse to adult violence, from damaged child to damaged man to something barely human at all. This understanding doesn't change what needs to happen when you encounter Eddie in the vocational block. Waylon still needs to escape. Eddie still needs to be stopped. Understanding Eddie's pathology doesn't mean accepting his behavior or allowing him to continue creating victims, but understanding adds depth. transforms Eddie from a simple antagonist into a tragic figure, and reminds us that horror games can do more than simply scare us. They can illuminate the real psychological horrors that exist in our world, the ways that abuse and institutional cruelty create cascading damage across years and lives. Eddie Gluskin is a character who shouldn't have worked. He's an antagonist in a horror game DLC, someone players encounter for maybe an hour of gameplay, and yet he's become one of the most discussed and analyzed characters in the horror genre. People write essays about him, create fan theories, debate his psychology, because he feels real in ways that simple villains don't. The developers at Red Barrels didn't just create a scary enemy with disturbing dialogue. They created a fully realized psychological profile, someone whose every action and word is consistent with a specific constellation of trauma and pathology, someone who makes horrible sense once you understand what made him. The research that went into Eddie's character is evident in every detail. The way he speaks, mixing romantic language with threats, is consistent with borderline pathology and delusional thinking. His surgical focus on creating brides reflects real patterns seen in certain types of serial killers who attempt to create perfect victims. His inability to recognize Wayland's resistance as legitimate mirrors the empathy deficits created by severe childhood abuse. His wedding imagery and romantic decorations show the dissociative split between his internal fantasy and external reality. Even his death, falling while lunging at his target, reflects the impulsive aggression and poor judgment that characterizes his mental state. This level of psychological realism in a horror game character is rare and valuable. It would have been easy to make Eddie a simple sadist, someone who tortures because he enjoys pain. That's a common horror trope, the torture porn villain who exists purely to disgust and frighten. Instead, the developers created someone whose violence serves a psychological function, someone whose torture is instrumental to a delusional goal rather than an end in itself. This makes Eddie more disturbing because his behavior has internal logic. He's not chaotic evil. He's lawful evil operating according to a framework that makes perfect sense within his fractured reality. The voice performance also matters. Eddie's voice actor delivers a combination of charm and menace that perfectly captures the character's duality. When Eddie sings, his voice is genuinely pleasant, almost soothing. When he calls for his darling, there's real tenderness. But underneath there's always the threat, the sense that this pleasant surface could explode into violence at any moment. The voice work transforms Eddie from disturbing concept into terrifying presence, making him feel like a real person rather than a collection of horror tropes. The lasting impact of Eddie Gluskin as a character speaks to something important about horror as a genre. The scares that stay with us aren't usually the jump scares or the gore, though those have their place. The horror that lingers is psychological, the recognition of damaged humanity, the understanding that monsters are made not born, the uncomfortable proximity between victim and perpetrator. Eddie Gluskin is frightening not because he's alien or inhuman, but because he's too human, because every piece of his pathology has roots in real psychological patterns, because players can trace the pathway from childhood abuse to adult monstrosity and recognize that this transformation, while rare, is possible. We fear Eddie not because we can't understand him, but because we can. His delusion about finding perfect love makes horrible sense, given his attachment trauma. His violence toward women makes horrible sense, given his history and pathology. His claiming of the vocational block and creation of a wedding venue makes horrible sense, given his need for control and his dissociative escape into fantasy. Every element clicks into place once you have the full picture, and that understanding is more disturbing than simple incomprehension would be. This is what sophisticated horror achieves. It doesn't just frighten us in the moment, it makes us think, makes us uncomfortable with our understanding, makes us recognize the thin lines between safety and danger, sanity and madness, victim and perpetrator. Eddie Gluskin does this as well as any horror character ever created, and that's why nearly 12 years after Outlast Whistleblower's release, people are still analyzing him, still discussing his psychology, still trying to fully understand the tragedy and horror of his character. In the end, Eddie Gluskin is a case study in how trauma destroys. Not just the initial trauma of childhood abuse, though that was devastating enough, but the cascading trauma, the way initial damage creates vulnerability to further damage, the way systems meant to help can instead harm, the way pathology deepens and metastasizes until recovery becomes impossible. He's a reminder that we create monsters through our failures, our cruelty, our willingness to see vulnerable people as less than human. His story is a warning about what happens when we don't protect children from abuse, when we don't provide accessible, trauma-informed mental health care, when we allow institutions to torture patients in the name of treatment or research, when we prioritize profit or scientific advancement over human dignity and well-being. Every failure in Eddie's life, from his father's abuse to Murkoff's experiments, contributed to the monster he became. Every intervention that should have happened and didn't left him more damaged, more dangerous, more lost. By the time Wayland Park encounters him in the vocational block, Eddie Gluskin is beyond saving. The person he might have been, the child who deserved love and safety and protection, died years ago if he ever existed at all. What remains is damage and delusion, violence and fantasy, a broken thing that looks human but functions according to rules so distorted that genuine humanity has become impossible. His death is the only possible ending because there was never going to be recovery or redemption. The damage was too severe, too layered, too reinforced by every subsequent trauma. He dies inside his delusion, believing until his last breath that Waylon was beautiful, that they could have been together, that his fantasy was real. He never gained insight, never broke free, never recognized the horror of what he'd done or what he'd become. And maybe that's a mercy, because if he had gained insight, if he'd suddenly understood the full weight of his crimes and the impossibility of his delusions, that moment of clarity would have been its own kind of torture. Eddie Gluskin wanted love and got abuse. He wanted safety and got violation. He wanted treatment and got torture. He wanted family and got isolation. And in the end, what he created from those deprivations was horror, a nightmare that consumed him and everyone who entered his domain. His story is tragic and monstrous in equal measure, a reminder that sometimes victims become perpetrators, sometimes damaged people damage others, and sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to end them, even knowing that the monster was made, not born.